Hello, everybody. I'm Vincent Solis, president of Brazosport College. Welcome to another episode of Chomp Talk, where we navigate the waters of all things BC related. Today, it is my privilege to have two of our most popular faculty members on campus. We're going to talk about art, the world of art instruction, and all things related to design and just the fun things that happen and the thought-provoking things that happen in our art classes. So today we have with us Miss Molly Ark. Miss Molly, thank you so much for being here. And Jackson Zorn, both instructors in our art departments. Folks, welcome to Chomp Talk. We're going to ease right into this. Tell us a little bit about your own personal journeys into the world of art, and then we'll get started into some more deeper questions about art and all things design related. So Molly, let's start with you.
When I was 5, my grandmother hung a drawing on a refrigerator, and that made me feel so special and proud that everyone walked by and oohed in awe that I was like, I need to do this. This feels really, really great. And so it was something that really brought all these people joy, including myself. So I was like, oh, I like this. How can I do this? And so I wanted to pursue that as professionally as I could. And
So you knew from the time you were
little, yeah,
really
yeah. Because I mean, it was something that was like everybody marveled over and everyone was happy with, and we laughed, and it was funny too. So
and memorable.
yeah, it was really memorable, and it was this like moment of like, oh, this is something I like to do, and everybody likes it too. So it was natural, and so that's where I was like, well, I should go to school for this, and I was fortunate enough to have colleges that had art scholarships, and then I had a wonderful teacher that like my second semester that just inspired me to think like, oh, I would like to do what she is making me think. She's pushing me. She's making me question my world and, really getting me to go beyond just like making something pretty. Because
Yeah.
when you're young, you make something
Yeah.
pretty.
Yeah, the hallmarks of great education is those faculty members that push, that get the best out of their students, that question, that teach. So, but Molly, it's part of your journey there. You've had this great education, and then we'll get over to Jackson a bit. But what do you enjoy the most about teaching our students at BC?
There is something fundamental when you are working with someone and you have those aha moments. And I feel like in art, I get them more than I get in like maybe in math class, I get them all the time too. But I feel like I
Yeah.
get them all the time in art because a lot of people think it has to be a certain way. And when you kind of turn that on its head and then they get it doesn't have to be a precise way, you've opened up the limitations to be, exponentially infinity as opposed to like this one answer I need, this one picture I need. Those moments of like aha are wonderful. And those keep you going because you'll have a student who always gets frustrated or someone who's done something wrong, but you always have that student who then will show you that you've reached them, you've gotten to them.
It's kind of that point of educators talk about Bloom's taxonomy, that highest level of creating new things, bringing new things into being. So art is one of those instances where you actually get to do that from day one in the classes. So thank you for your responses on that. Jackson, what about you? What was your journey like, and what do you most enjoy about teaching our students?
Yeah, so my dad's an architect, and that was just pencils that are around the house. Like, if he was a mechanic, it would have been wrenches and stuff. But it was one of those things of like he partly owned his own business. So if he was in his office most of the time, and it was in the basement, and that's where I would go draw, just constantly. And I guess just there was something intrinsic about kind of watching your own hand. As I grew older, I kind of realized it's like watching your own hand make something, right? And kind of come to fruition in front of you, leaving your like mark in a sense. And it feels really good, regardless of like the accolades or praise from an exterior source. But for me, it felt really good. And it was kind of a search. Like I gotta figure out how to like do this forever. Like 'cause this feels good.
So how do you convey that to our students? How do you, because art is one of these disciplines that's different in that it brings you, not to say that the other disciplines don't bring you that sense of joy and accomplishment. Everybody's got a different, unique perspective on what they enjoy. But art is one of these things, to your point, where you're creating something. It brings you joy. It's therapeutic. It helps in a lot of different ways. How do you navigate the process with students in that capacity?
I guess to clarify too, therapeutic and feeling good doesn't always mean
Right.
it feels good in a traditional sense. It feels good like letting go sometimes too.
Yeah.
Um,
Or understanding.
yeah. So that kind of wedging that sometimes with students, and even as you create with myself too, you notice there's like a crack in the armor, right? You're like, start to see in there a little bit. And then I guess for Molly and myself, that comes the way to pry that crack open is by creation, and start to understand yourself. So enabling students to do that too. A lot of times you have to do it in a more technical way of like, this is how you visually measure a still life, or this is how you build a coil pot, to get them the tools to open that crack, um, in a technical sense, because they look at it as like, these are things I need to learn how to do, and I need to draw quote unquote good to make me feel quote unquote good. But once you realize, like, it really doesn't have to be that good to start delving into
Right.
that crack. But there is I think, to a budding artist, they they're so self-reliant on the idea of being graded, what is good versus what is bad, that you do as a professor impart the skills to visually improve their abilities. But I think at the end of the day, once those abilities get to where they need to be, then some real self-reflection can happen, because you don't have to necessarily worry about if you can draw it well or build it well, because that's easy. You can learn that,
Yeah.
right? Um, you can't learn how to like really dig into your inner self and express yourself visually to others. That's much more taller of an order.
Yeah.
And you can see when a student starts to reach down deep and like pull out some stuff
Yeah.
that they haven't experienced quite yet about themselves.
So how do you, as instructors on both ends, how do you, to dovetail into that question, this process of awareness, discovery that is beyond the tangible pieces that come with design or art or drawing or painting or sculpting or whatever it is, you think about what art can elicit as a response. How do you help students navigate that? I often, when you think of these modern pieces and modern-ish, I often think of Munch's The Scream. It's a simple painting, but what it conveys in this very simple, and simple in air quotes, uh, painting, I mean, just can elicit, just any number of unlimited responses from people, especially in a modern world. How do you help students navigate that? I mean, these responses. It's more than just let me paint something or let me draw something, let me design something. It's also, as instructors, I would imagine, managing that response of students all of a sudden dealing with a lot of, thought-provoking ideas that are percolating when they experience art. How do you guys navigate that?
Well, when you were talking like the notion of modern, when you look at modern art, it doesn't have usually as much information, and I tell students like, you when you were looking at this, what are we getting from this? And a lot of times if they're like nothing, and then I said, well, you're only getting as much as you're giving into it. So if you are not able to look at it and then think about what your thoughts are and be honest and genuine with yourself, you're not going to pull anything out of it, because you can go and look at the Rothko Chapel where there's these, very huge, grander pieces of just one color field, and it's more experiential where you have to then, what am I getting from looking at this? What is this artist thing? You have to start to think. And so it is harder to get someone to think when they have a landscape, because they're like, well, that's the picture of outside. And they have an answer. And so I feel like when we start to look at things like modernist work, people in general can start to go, well, what do I see? And then we can have a discussion of like, what you see is not what I see.
Right.
But we're not, neither of us are wrong. But what are we, or do we have any common threads that we get through? And even if we don't have common threads, we can see like, oh, we both have really, really visceral emotions. And so maybe this piece is about emoting qualities of our own emotions. And so it's having that dialogue of looking at pieces and talking about them. That's where when we're in like a student critique setting, I always start with like, this is your work, it's not you. So when we are talking about it, we're trying to improve you as an artist. We're not trying to say like, if this is wrong, this is a character flaw in you. And so I feel like when you're having like these deeper discussions about the work, you have to be open to, saying things that maybe are showing your vulnerability and your like weaknesses and flaws so that students can say, oh, okay, he's not perfect. He's not perfect. I'm not perfect. And I can express that. And I feel like in a critique situation where we start to have like a dialogue of like, well, why did you make these choices? And someone doesn't understand why they did make those choices, to kind of openly have that conversation. And
So
so,
Molly, let me ask you, this is a fascinating part of the conversation. How often does that kind of discussion take place in your classes for either one of you? When you're having those deep level conversations about, extracting from within, going back to that high level order thinking, how often does that happen?
well, I would say it's hard I would say within my design class, I have an assignment where I say you cannot have anything that represents anything.
No?
And the first sentence, they're like, oh, what am I going to do? And so there's a lot of just stopping and no movement and they're just thinking in their head, and you can see that they're trying to solve and unravel that puzzle. And then trying to also, I said, okay, but you have to represent the word ubiquitous. And so then we talk about vocabulary too. So then also we're looking up words that maybe some know, but maybe some are like, I've never heard this word. And we read the definition and we're like, well, what is an example? And so we kind of talk through like what this words mean. Then once we get words that, we know it means, how can we have that conveyed in a feeling of an image, So is it darkness? Is it pattern? Is it chaos?
Yeah.
So that's where you get it when you have to like really challenge them to kind of start to dig things apart and deconstruct things. And then after the deconstructed, you're like, well, now you have to reconstruct it, but it can't look like anything at all. Because
Amazing.
like the answer is you're just like, oh, I just want to make a gator. I just want to make a cup. I just want to make something that's recognizable. And when you pull out like that flooring from underneath, that's where you have to kind of like figure out how to fly or float. Or if you drop, maybe drop slowly.
Yeah. Those are big discussions. Jackson, what about with you in your classes? What do those conversations look like?
Probably very similar. I mean, there's a there's an aspect of it that's one-on-one too. There's often some resistance, and often it's like you're revisiting these ideas too. It's not grand ideas don't come in a pop, I suppose. It's not a light bulb that switches on. It's a sunrise that kind of like
Happens.
should be on a greetings
Mhm.
card. But like it gradually develops itself, right? It's not most ideas don't come within a eureka moment, or even if they do, there is definitely a lead to the eureka. So it's kind of letting it simmer, marinate, as you said too, like watching the gears turn. As a professor, being very keen on where people are within that process, nudging who needs to be nudged, not nudging who doesn't need a nudge. In regards to kind of understanding how to, I would say, translate ideas, kind of the initial question, there needs to, you're developing a language. People don't think about it as a language. It's a language. You're trying to portray an idea through visual form, and that's not easy. So because at the end of the day, you have this beautiful idea, this ethereal thing, and you're having to portray it in this rather crude, very physical way. And I mean crude in a sense of versus ethereal and clean. You're having to portray it with like ink and a pen and a piece of paper or a piece of earth. So a lot can get lost in translation. And I kind of encourage students, the more they, what I call visual empathy, not feeling bad for something or an object, but understanding it visually. The more you can understand the visual language of the scream or like images like at Rothko Chapel, the more capable you are of understanding those dialogues that can happen between you and the piece, the more likely you are to be able to produce those dialogues too, because you're becoming keen on that language. It's very hard to just come in and understand that language immediately too. So in drawing, at least, I often stress like, well, what's the viewer going to think about this? Not that we're always creating for the viewer, but if you're aiming to do this professionally, then you need to make sure what you're saying translates. Not that's a way to put it. Make sure what you're saying is translating correctly. So you're not creating for a viewer. You're making sure that your language is legible to the most people as possible. And if we look at Taylor Swift, Pablo Picasso, Edvard Munch, Rothko, like the list goes on. You name a famous artist, and it's like they figured out how the language works, right? Like that's really all they did. Like Taylor Swift knows how to make me feel like her.
Yeah.
And then I can relate.
Okay.
And I don't even listen to Taylor Swift
Right.
that much. But that's the key, is having that visual empathy, or in that case, like auditory empathy, of understanding like, is what I'm putting out legible to those around me.
So Jackson, so going back to the question, or to the part about creativity, for that student who's taking an art class because they want to be either art teachers or artists, or they want to go into the field, their perspective in many ways is about creating something that others are going to be examining, interpreting, looking for as a product or a service, or versus the student who comes in and says, I want to do this solely for my own intrinsic purposes. How do you navigate those two students in the classroom? Is it that one-on-one conversation? Is it the projects that they get assigned, or how do you guys work through that?
For my students, they all are assigned the same projects typically. How I direct them, I suppose, within that project, that's where the change kind of comes in. It's also kind of concerns itself with how much I expect of them in regards to like research, of like, if you're making this a lifestyle, then it needs to be treated as a lifestyle. Like this needs to be on your radar 24/7. Like that. There's no way around it. Like you have to live, breathe, sweat, cry, bleed art. Especially, I mean, not to say, and I think, and it goes for any profession. Like if you want to be good at something, you want people to pay you to do this thing. Like you have to make it your life, essentially. And then the other students who are coming in possibly for more therapeutic reasons, or maybe they're just testing the water, or maybe they don't know why they're doing it. Maybe they're like me and like, this feels good, so I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it more and more. They're usually fairly open about that's their reasoning. And I think that comes more into play of then my task is to try to make them enjoy doing that more. Get them to the level they want to be at, as opposed to they need to be at for a profession, I suppose.
How much of the hands-on experience that students get in the classes that you both teach is part of why your classes are so popular, why you're sought after by the students? Is it the experiential learning piece, or is it these kinds of discussions that are going on? Is it a combination? Why are you guys so popular with the students?
I don't know. It's me. I think it's Clay. There's like I, I teach other classes, but Clay is definitely where I have what I would say the most repeat offenders, where
Yeah,
people want to come back
back and back.
and more. And it's such a process based thing where, Jackson's talking about drawing. Drawing has that instant gratification where you can get something, you know, everyone's been in that pinch the night before a drawing class, spending up all night and made something maybe really amazing. The night before for your ceramics project is not
Not
going to
gonna
be as
work.
amazing because there's gravity and there's all these scientific reasons, drying and wetness and humidity, that's not going to make that as an accomplishment. So you have to have really a journey involved. And so I feel like a lot of times for people, clay is like this journey that when they start, they just get more entrenched in because there's so much science if you want to have science in it. There's so much whimsy and play if you want it. So you can go in either direction. So you could have that really analytical mind who wants to research how there's shrinkage rates in clay bodies that have, different crystalline glazes. And there's a lot of things that you could get really technical and learn and be very specific and technical. And then there's the other end where it's just like, oh, I could do this and this, and you could just have all this mounting information that it's just like continuous play where you can never ever like run out of a new idea. And so that's where the medium, I think, helps me a lot. I like it too, but I feel like that's what happens a lot of times. The medium, people start on something and they see someone else do something and they're like, ooh, I want to try that, and they don't have enough time that time, so they got to come back, and come back and do it
But I
again.
think there's also a part, I mean, and for our viewing audience, you can kind of get a sense for the kind of instructors that we have at Brazosport College, not just in the art program, but in all of our programs. If you've seen any of our previous podcasts, you get a sense of the caliber of instructor that we have at the college. And these kinds of discussions, I think the students gravitate to them. I think that as human beings, we all, want to have these kinds of interactions, discussions. We come to college and this concept of higher learning to really delve into these deeper, broader subjects that, sometimes awaken things within us that you're like, a lot of times we go to school and say, this is what my major is going to be. Then you take that one class, you're like, forget about everything that I've been planning for. This is what I want to do. That's what the process is all about.
Yeah.
I remember when I went to school, I was like, oh, I'm going to be a biologist. I took one biology class. I'm like, I'm not going to do this. Like, you know, took my first psych class. I'm like, this is what I want to
Yeah.
do. So there's just things that I think that, when people are really into or whatever they're working on makes them happy, brings them joy, brings them a sense of satisfaction. I mean, that's kind of the hook, right? You get those students. Let me ask this. I'm sure that you do, because I see the art shows. We've got a great gallery viewing audience. If you ever want to come by and check out a great gallery that posts our student work, guest artist work, our instructors' work. I go in there all the time, and there's really great pieces in there. But there are clearly some students that you're just like, wow, like holy cow, like where did they get what they're displaying? So you got some students that are very, very talented, right? That they are just they're cut above in terms of that product. But how do you work with that whole mix of students? Because you're going to have the Vince who shows up like, I've never done anything like this. How do I get to that point? And then you've got the Jacksons and the Mollys that have been doing it or are good at it naturally. And, that I look over and all of a sudden you've got, this great ceramics piece and I'm trying to make a cup, right? So, I mean, how do you back, because there's something there for everybody, because I've seen the students, your students are in every range, every major. How do you guys work through that? How do you spend that time with that one student? You're like, this student has a lot of talent. And how do you spend the time on, hey, this student may not have that level of talent, but has a lot of interest, a lot of passion, a lot of,
And that's where I think clay has a lot of forgiveness because, like, the person who maybe has a lot of talent is like, oh, I'm going to make a sculpture of this thing. And they have this really specific vision and dialogue that already going on. But then the other person who's not so sure, we're like, well, let's make a vase. And with that vase, do you want to try to carve in designs? Do you want, and so you can use patterning design. You don't need to have it like realistically look like a Raphael where, it doesn't have
Right.
to have that. It can just be this experience where like this person is journeying from like totally knowing nothing to creating something. That's why like I have like, okay, your first project is 16 inches because when you do something on a scale that is large, 16 inches is not huge, but it's large when you're starting off. that it gives you a sense of accomplishment. So when you did that, you're like, well, I can do anything. I built something big already. And so when I have students start with that, what I try to do is I try to give them something that I want them to reference. And then I say, now I need you to do some research, and you bring in like what you're interested in. And when they bring in something that they're interested in, it gives me more of an idea of what they are looking at, what they actually like. And so then I can go, okay, they like this. I know some other artists that I can kind of turn them on to and kind of help to inspire them. And so I feel like when they're beginning artists, it's finding the voice that inspires them the most. Not what inspires me the most, but what inspires them. So when they have art that they bring in and I give them art, I ask them to put these two things together. So they don't have to be scared to create, because you have this image and this image. What happens when they come together? How do you merge them? And so it's not like, okay, good luck, go. It's like,
Yeah.
mix this and this. What's going to happen? And then when we look at it, we mix it, what's going to happen. Their drawing and what it translates three-dimensionally is even different, and that's okay. And so the best part is it's like such a process that I feel like life has that process when you're going
And
through
for
and
some
learning.
folks, the process is sometimes, if not sometimes, more important
Yeah.
than the outcome of whatever. Just going through building something, designing something, working on something, focusing on something. I'm a big believer that everybody needs to have a passion or a hobby or something that
An
quiets the
outlet,
mind.
you know?
Outlet. You got to have it, whatever that is. But I've always been a big believer that you need something that the mind or the brain can focus on, that you enjoy doing, be it, walking, running, lifting weights, art, reading. There's got to be something that can, especially in the modern world, the modern brain just, it goes and goes and goes, but you need something that quiets it, that brings us that peace.
Art is
So,
meditative. Art
yeah.
has a very meditative thing for people who don't meditate. I know Jackson is better at meditation than me, but art is very meditative for me in the sense that like that's where I could be quiet.
Yeah.
That's where I'm just going to sit and like carve away at this one spot, or I'm just going to rub this one spot over and over. And so it has a very like meditative kind of quieting of the mind and just like pulling in your focus. I feel like that's the other thing that art can do that is needed, is it can pull in a focus, because right now everybody has like a really short focus, and
Yeah.
this is something that can really prolong your focus.
Because it's required. You have to
Yeah,
focus.
to
You have to,
accomplish,
yes.
you have to have that
Yeah.
focus, and I think that's where like a beginning person, even if they don't have like the skill set that maybe the person next to them, they can develop it, and as long as they can really get into that flow, their focus they can produce something that's really, pretty phenomenal.
So let's talk a little bit about the rewarding part of teaching. You both work with students on a day in and day out basis. There's a lot of rewarding moments that come with that. What do you both find most rewarding about teaching our students? Jackson, we'll start with you.
Yeah, it's when you can. I think in studio art courses, it's rewarding to see someone accomplish kind of their own goals that they've set up for themselves. Um, be that have to do with skill level or showing in a gallery somewhere or perhaps transferring. Because we might have intentions as professors or goals for certain students, or like see them as like they could potentially do something. But if they reach our goals, that means very little to them. So seeing them accomplish what they're setting out to do, and for some of them, that's purely just get better at making ceramics or drawing, and there's no intention of doing it beyond the classroom. But for others, it's something much more vast and much larger. And knowing that we as professors had a small part in that kind of process is rewarding, to help someone achieve what they're trying to achieve. I often find like in art appreciation, I find that a little, probably to be honest, more rewarding. Because I tend to learn more there in learning other people's opinions about artwork, especially young people's opinions. That's where it's going to go, regardless of what we would like to think. Like, my opinion at this point matters very little if we think 70 to 80 years down the road. Their opinion, that room full of 20 to like 30-year-olds, that's the opinion that's going to matter. That's the one that's going to be around. So I feel like for me, like that's more rewarding as a professor is to work within those lecture spaces because that's where I'm actually learning like where the future of art is going. I'm not the future of art anymore, right?
We'll get back to that question
Yeah.
because I got some questions on that.
So that's kind of the where I see the rewards kind of coming to me or where I see that happening in the classroom.
What about you, Molly? What do you find most rewarding?
I think what's most rewarding me personally is I can go back and list teachers that inspired me or that I connected with, and I hope that I connect and inspire some, and I hope that I'm like a part of their memory base because like I feel like that's what I make a lot of my artwork about is my personal memories, and so if I hoping to like scratch a little bit into the mind of some of my students, and that I'm in there down the road that I could influence things they think about, things they do down the road beyond that like connection we have, especially if it was like, oh, they're going to transfer. They're like, okay, see you. And you never know, but you're always hopeful that like something you said or did influences them and makes them like a better human being.
Sure.
So I feel like I remember so many of my instructors and teachers from the past that like, if I'm even in a fraction of my students' minds like that, it's a really great place to be. And so that's something that's like not tangible.
Right. It's
Yeah.
what all teachers aspire to have that impact on someone's life because we never know what they're going to go do, who they're
Yeah.
going to go become, what they're going to go influence or shape, and if we had a hand in it,
Yeah.
that's a big deal. That's the dividend of the heart. You run into somebody or you get that email from a student from 20 years ago, and they're like, "Hey, doc, just want to let you know that this is what I'm up to, and things are going well." So those are the big moments.
You connected with them. You
Yeah.
know that like there
Yeah.
was something beyond just like a checklist of a classroom experience. And
Yeah.
it could be a person who like I took art appreciation with you, and when I transferred, I took this other art class, and it was awesome. And like you wouldn't think that you would do that, but you could do that for
You can
someone.
connect.
You know?
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. So Jackson, getting back to your question about the future of art for both of you, where's the future of art headed? I mean, there's so much that happens in the world of the digital space. You've got art instructors all over things like social media and YouTube and digital age. You've got questions and discussions about AI and art and just where's it headed? Where do you see it as you're a pretty traditional art instructor. Where do you see, although I do see you guys fiddling with the art pads and I've seen some of not the iPads and I see some of the things you guys do on the digital side, but where's it all headed?
I think the next, probably closest frontier, I suppose, would be working in digital spaces with the ability. I guess COVID kind of kickstarted this idea and kind of brought it into fruition to some extent, as COVID kickstarted lots of things. Um, but the idea of creating in a virtual space and then other people being able to visit that virtual space. There are still there's still there's still hangups, I feel like, with the idea of tangibility for older artists, myself included. And I don't think I'm that old, but there are hangups with the idea that it must be in a gallery, it must be me traveling somewhere, it must be like you can touch it, I must be literally standing in front of it. I don't think the students that we teach have that issue. It's the same likeness to how foreign when you begin to buy your music digitally. Like I would still go buy CDs for a good 2 or 3 years probably because I wanted the booklet for whatever reason, right?
Yeah, you
Artwork. It
interface.
had
Yeah.
artwork
Yeah,
in it.
and it was like, why do you really have it if you only have it digitally? And I know like both of our children play video games and like you can buy all that just through the system, but you can still like Best Buy is holding on tight that those parents will still come in and like buy the literal little card that drops in. And they do buy the literal card that drops in there. So I think work within digital spaces is probably where we'll traverse next. But I think at the end of the day too, it still remains mark making. Like, what's the difference in like some of the first paintings from like 64,000 years ago in a cave in Spain and a painting in digital sense? To me, like, I'm not going to be in front of either in reality. So I think there is a lot more, and I think there's a lot more fluidity to exposure that way.
There is more exposure, and I think for those students that can identify a market, I think it also puts them into a space where they can reach people where they couldn't before. You see the videos of, people be like, hey, if I get to 10,000 likes, this will happen. And they turn around, they got this cool painting, and people, go crazy with it in terms of supporting the artist. So I think that there is that digital space that is providing a much larger base, much larger market, a much larger exposure to an audience that, maybe wouldn't have ever seen that artist because they're somewhere on the other side of the world. But because of the algorithms and the likes that they've gotten, you all of a sudden get exposed to it. And I think that that's a big part of the human experience is sharing with one another these creative things that for now have only been in the realm of humanities. Molly, what about you?
Well, I think the more imminent future and even now, immersive spaces are having a huge influence. If you go up to Houston, there's like 4 or 5 different immersive spaces that you can pay a fee and go and be within this world in itself, And so I feel like its predecessor was Santa Fe's Meow Wolf, but now Houston has a Meow Wolf. So it's like this space where you have groups of artists, like Houston-based artists are all making this huge immersive space that you can, open a dryer door and go down a slide and end up in a cave, of like zombies. It's just really weird because you have so many different artist views coming in, making this space that you interact in, and you pay an entry fee that's not quite Disneyland prices, but you know what I mean? It's costly enough that it's like you're going to be there for that period of time. You're having this experience. So I feel like these immersive experience-based are very popular and going to keep moving because they do lend themselves to social media. People take pictures of themselves there and show that they're there. So it's a status thing as well to be able to be in these spaces and look silly, crazy, or beautiful, whatever you're going for. But those are something that it can transcend ages too, because I could take, my parents who are in their 70s and I could take my kids who are like 8 and 6 and they all would have an experience. And maybe my parents would think it was crazy, but my kids would think it was awesome or vice versa. But they have this group memory that you're created together that you can kind of go back to, similar to like a theme park, So it is like this space that creates this time and this memory and this experience. They seem to be really focused on like joy and positivity, but it could go into different realms in the future. I feel like that's where you could have these experiential places kind of give you different feelings and thoughts, but like immersive spaces where you are surrounded 360 degrees by different art all around, and then you walk into another space and it's a total another realm. So I've experienced a few in Phoenix, I've experienced a few across the nation, and they have a similar feeling, but they all have their kind of own take. And so I feel like that experiential base where sometimes the participants are asked to add on to something or interact with it is something that is definitely more popular right now. I don't know how long it will last or where it will go, but I feel like that's definitely having a surge.
Impact. We talk a little bit about the experiential part of an art class, whether it's, a drawing class or a ceramics course. How do you work or do you all work deliberately in terms of getting students to collaborate with one another? One of the things that we hear from industry partners are things like developing soft skills and making sure people have, good team building capacity, working well with one another. Do you all have opportunities in your class for students to work in group projects and work with each other on different things art related?
I have a design project that is group related. We do tape murals on campus, and so they're temporary. So they're not a permanent thing, but they're a temporary thing where we usually have them up for like 2 weeks, and I try to pick out different places in campus, and there's like 3 students, and those three have to come together. They get like 2 colors of tape, and here's your wall, and what can you do together in this 2 week span? So basically about 20 hours of work time and think time to get this thing off the ground. And that is usually where you see, you know, people try to create some kind of structure, and sometimes people say, "Well, I'm going to," kind of they break things apart. You see how people start to work together to accomplish the goal,
Right.
and sometimes you see a group that is just fluid, where you can tell that like I say something to you, you respond, and then he responds, and you have this like good dynamic. And sometimes it's like this one person trying to steer the ship, and those two other
Yeah.
workers are just
The
not
sto-
on
the
board.
sto- the story of group and collaborative work
And
in college
that's
classes.
where I feel like Jackson and I, as the instructor, have to kind of step in and say,
Yeah.
"Hey, what's going on here?" and kind of like talk it through. Because if they're not talking it through, and their dynamic is not where it needs to be, just like in a working situation, the boss would have to step in and see what's going on.
Cool.
And then you might see, okay, well, this person is a little bit headstrong, and then how do you get that person to dial it back so that they can listen to the other voices and make sure that like the idea is unified. It's not just one person's idea, and these people are just the labor front for
Right.
it. So
Absolutely.
I do try to have one, because it is not always the most popular.
No, but it's so needed. I mean,
yeah,
we
it is.
at the end of the day, I know that there's digital spaces and Zoom meetings and virtual work, but we still interact with one another daily, and you got to get along to move along, and I think that those are the kinds of things that we want to instill in our students,
Yeah.
not just the technical pieces of whether it's a math or an English or an art class, but what makes them better citizens, or how more productive citizens, or how are they going to be successful in whatever their chosen field is, be it art
Basic
or
communication. Like that's what you have to do in a group project. You
Yeah.
have to work on that, just basic communication, because if you don't, that's where you see the group is struggling, because they
Absolutely.
aren't talking to each other.
Yeah.
And I had a group where the student came to me kind of privately, and he said, I wasn't sure about anything this guy said, but after critique, and people looked at it and talked about it, I kind of saw where his vision and mine, where they intersected, and there was a good thing, as opposed to me dominating. So like he had a reflective moment
Yeah.
afterwards, but he definitely was, knew he was kind of conflicting with this person. But it's something about self-discovery, maybe as much in that group project,
But I go back to those higher learning orders, when we teach. Art is one of those classes that just gets you to that point where because there are some classes where you're going to learn new information, and they're all great, and you're going to learn to solve a math problem or, write an essay. But when you're talking about really thinking through something that can really elicit a lot of thought or provoke, strong emotions, there's a few classes that'll do that. A few classes, there's also some really great instructors out there that have mastered the art of doing that, because that's what good teachers do. But in the world of art, I mean, you can just look at something, you're like, okay, this is making me think or feel a certain way, or it's a powerful tool for that perspective.
Well, and I think a lot of times an outsider will have like a misconception and be like, well, obviously there just must be really good, or art's just easy, like anybody could do, like they kind of like
Yeah.
the one-off thing. You're like, well, it's just easy. Anybody could do that. So it's like, if it was so easy, then I say to the person, come show
try it.
show me
Yeah.
how easy it
Yeah.
is. I would love to see what you make and what you create, because I feel like then once they start get vested into it, they see that it's only as easy as their first perception, and then they dig deeper, and the layers of
I have a follow-up to that, Mike.
Yeah.
So let me ask both of you on this one. And so when we talk about things like social media, and if you follow art pages, which I do because I love art. This is one of my favorite topics. I could talk about this all day. But, there's things in the art world where you see someone who has talent or experience or has been doing it for a long time. Like the day I walked into our new dean's office, and he had one of your artworks with the Mandalorian, I believe, and Baby Yoda, and
Yeah.
and I was like, wow, that is super cool, right? So you can see that there is something that somebody put together with a lot of talent. And then you see some of these things on social media where, like I saw one where two artists had tied their hands together, and They were trying to pull each other in different directions. They had a giant canvas, and they're pulling each other on the scribbles, right?
Mhm.
And the audience is like really happy for them as they finish. They take their bow there. So you have these two scribbles that are interconnected. There's a lot of meaning in what they're doing. It's performance art. It's the visual art. But then you get the people who may not understand what they're trying to get to, and they just the criticism goes into, well, I could do that, But I think that they're missing a point in terms of what the artist is trying to convey. It's not just the scribbles that go on the wall or the art that goes on the wall or the doodle or whatever it is that they're doing. It's the message that goes beyond that. I think getting people to understand that piece is because if you're not thinking about it, you're gonna be like, well, I could do that. I mean, I could.
That's why exposing art appreciation to performance art is like
Yeah.
one of my favorite things because there's so much
Yeah.
diversity within it. Like there's stuff that's scary, there's stuff that's horrifying, but there's stuff that's hilarious and funny.
Yeah.
There's stuff that's serious. And so you can show them this broad swath and they're like, this is art because you've just kind of blown their mind of what art could
Mhm.
be
Yeah.
because their notion of art is like there's a sculpture, there's a painting.
Yes, exactly.
And then you were like, because they in their mind they're like, well, if they're doing something, isn't it theater? Or if they're like singing a note, isn't it music? It's like, how can this be art? And so maybe pushing limitation
Have
is
you
like the
seen
best they could do.
the video that's making the rounds online about the guy who stacks up the red buckets in sand? So he's in an art gallery, and there's a lot of people around,
Mhm.
and he stacks up these these red plastic
Mhm.
buckets full of sand. So he goes to the bottom and he punctures one of the buckets, and the sand starts to fill out, right?
Mhm.
So it starts to pour out, and then you see this tower just. So then it all crashes and the sand goes everywhere, right? And he's like, "There, I did it," So it provokes thought, right? Because if you're just looking at it and says like, "Well, I could stack up 6 or 7 buckets," and yeah, but you hadn't thought of that idea first, So it's kind of it's really interesting, but
But then you can sit and talk about, well, what's it mean?
what does it mean?
Why is he doing
Why
it?
is he
Like,
doing that?
you
Yeah.
know, and that's where
That's where the
Jackson could tell me
learning
why, and I
happens.
could disagree. Like, no, this is why.
Yeah.
And like Jackson was talking about before with the notion of a visual language, like the more exposure you have to these visuals, the more broad your language is, the more understanding you have of this universal language.
Yeah,
that,
cult
you know,
art. Yeah.
yeah.
It goes back to your point. You can do a cave painting or, The Mandalorian in digital design. So, what about you, Jackson? How do you get students to collaborate on their work?
Collaboration. I would say it happens more in design. There seem to be a little more accepting of letting people kind of tinker within their playground to an extent. It happens in drawing too, but I would say it's a little more hands off. It's more suggestive and like maybe you could try this, or I like what you did there. Could you show me how to do that? But it's a little more hands off in drawing and painting. Until there's a certain, it's kind of weird. It's a double-edged sword. It's like the students in design usually are very early on in their art careers, so they haven't placed too much worth on creation, on the final product of creation yet. So it's totally cool if someone steps in and helps them create. Then there's that middle stage where everything you make is the greatest thing you've ever made. Then you reach a stage, as we were discussing, like, are you going to cut that cup in half? You're just going to throw that drawing away? It's a demo. Why would I keep it? Like, and you reach that place where perhaps the finished product doesn't mean quite as much anymore. Yeah, sure, come on, let's draw all over it, sure. I've recently kind of started talking about drawing classes about like there's not, we use drawing as a noun, right? We shouldn't. Like it should just be a verb. Like because it's very process oriented. You're only drawing when you're drawing, right? Like just because I did a drawing doesn't mean I'm drawing. So it's in kind of getting, and that's a really hard hurdle for a lot of people to leap over. It's like, let somebody just come in and like,
well, sure, you're vulnerable.
Mess with that a little bit. And they're
Mhm.
like, I don't know. So collaboration can be tough, but I think I think it happens through shared ideas a lot within kind of the intermediate classes where it's not as hands-on collaboration. But there are those other ends of the spectrum, and we have students that way too that are totally open to like, yeah, come on, sure.
Yeah.
Like I could name a couple that would have no problem like relinquishing control on a project because they know that more interesting things can come from uncertainty than could ever be experienced than with certainty. Um, as all three of us know, in different crafts, there becomes a set process that you can kind of fulfill to complete said thing, which is certain, positively no problem. I can have that done for you by Friday. Am I going to enjoy it? No, because I'm
Right,
going to
'cause
be a robot
exactly.
doing these standard movements. Now, if we throw in like a hurricane or the lights go out or, or all of a sudden I run out of paintbrushes or pencils or tools needed, or all of a sudden you have to use a kick wheel again, like, like now it starts to be, did you have fun? Like, kind of, yeah,
Yeah.
because uncertainty was thrown in there, but it takes some, it doesn't
Yeah,
come naturally.
I think to your point, if I have, like if I got several projects to do on my end, and if it feels like work, like I'll do everything I can to put off doing. Just like I just don't want to do it. It becomes tedious. It becomes a like anything that if I have to do like multiple of the same project, I'm like I lose. At that point, it's no longer art for me. It's no longer a it's no longer something that I'm doing because I want to enjoy doing. It's something that I'm having to do, and for some reason, my brain, and I don't know if it's like that for you all, but when it becomes that, it just shuts off. It doesn't become enjoyable. I'm like, okay, I got to get through this. I got to make 6 of whatever. But when you get to do that one project that you're working on and you take your time on it and you enjoy it, that can be that's where I think you reach that that level of you know therapeutic, self, mental health. So it's an important part of the process. You mentioned something about collaboration, and we're going to close on this piece. You worked, Jackson, on a project for Gunfallons on campus, and Gunfallons, for the viewing audience, these are the banners that we use as part of our esprit de corps in graduation ceremonies. And Jackson and a group of folks on campus, faculty and staff, worked on putting together designs, the meanings, the colors. You want to tell us a little bit about that project?
Yeah, so it was a set of 7, I believe, gunfalons that would appear at graduation. One represented the college as a whole. 5 represented different divisions within the college, and then 1 represented the faculty at the college and the kind of essence of teaching, I suppose. Each one was catered to its specific section of the college, if you will, that it represented. Yet they had unifying themes, such as color, such as some of the symbols used within them. And then the process was each division or section of the college was asked to make a shorthand list, if you will, about what kind of represented what they thought represented them as their function at the college, essentially. So an example would be, and these examples could be as metaphorical as you please, or as straightforward as you please. And then those were kind of given, and then it was kind of a back and forth process to figure out what imagery would work. So an example would be community education came up with this idea that throughout history, which I didn't know, and in media as well, like a well is often used to represent the well-being of a community. And this is where you hear like the well's been poisoned or things like that. Like, that's kind of the where that idea comes from. It means there's trouble within the community, hence someone poisoned the well. Or it could just mean in general something is amiss. So that the water in the well, or if the well is dry, or if it's abundant, often represents the direct correlation to how the community is doing. So we went through a few different iterations of that. We ended up using a gourd, which would use to be carried water. So it indirectly referenced the well. And that was, through a few different iterations of using an actual well, using a bucket, using another type of gourd. And that's kind of the way we worked on all 5 of the divisions gunfalons. And I think they came out well. They came out to represent the departments they were aiming to. I learned a lot about the other parts of the college I didn't know about previously. And it was really interesting to see how other people in the college viewed themselves. Especially, I feel like we all are together, but we can often feel isolated too into our respective classrooms. And kind of, you're not quite always sure how your colleague might be viewing the importance of their profession as well. So it was an opportunity to kind of understand that, especially for people who are like physically in different parts of the campus. There's no, I don't like make my way over to like Sadler and
Right.
the BAT area all that often because there's no intentional purpose. I mean, that doesn't stop me from going and saying hello or whatever, but it's just not as often as I would be around the area I typically am. So it was nice to kind of have communications with those areas and start to discuss like, well, what's important to you? Like if we're summing you up in 3 different forms that'll be drawn, what are those? Because that's a pretty that's a pretty heavy question to ask somebody. I mean, it's not as heavy as like what goes on your gravestone, but it's like it's pretty there. You only get 3 words to describe yourself. Go, and then
they're there forever.
Yeah. So it was really informative and it a great output of what came from it.
Well, thank you for your work on that.
Thank you.
Last thought, what do students need to know about taking one of your classes?
That anyone can take any of our classes, and that's the hardest thing to say is like just try it because you're going to learn something, a skill or technique, but you probably will learn something about yourself. That's really, I think, what they don't think about. They don't think they're going to learn about themselves. The other wonderful things about studio is you're spending time in an environment with these people, and whomever is in your class, you know probably better than you know most people because you're with them for such a long period of time doing something, both being really vested into something that you get a good connection. Like a lot of my classes, when they, they're going to do something, they all walk as a group because they feel like a group, they feel together. So it gives that notion of togetherness. And so like, if they're going to take a class, just be open to trying new things, and you don't have to know anything about it before you walk in the door. That's the best part about it.
Come have a good time in Molly Art's class. That's awesome. Jackson, any last?
Yeah, I would say the same. I mean, I always tell my students that there's a line is a line, and when it comes to drawing, like it's how you bend that line around is what makes a drawing. And some people are like, that's a good line. And other people look at it like, that's an ugly, crude line. It's like, but if I grab both ends, straighten it out, like same line. So again, it is for everybody because it's the same line.
Yeah.
There is I'll second what Molly said. There's a camaraderie that grows within you're spending 6 hours a week with.
Yeah.
And you're all there for the same reason. Sometimes the room is silent and it's just the pounding of clay or the scratching of a pencil like on paper, and like I love that sound. Um and there's something that kind of forms there that doesn't necessarily happen in other classes. Everyone's there for the same reason, which isn't always the case in other. When you're in a class to create, like
But you're there.
everyone's there to create, and you all respect that about one another. Because it's daring, it's brave, it's courageous to take an art studio class. So
Well, folks, for our viewing audience, you get a sense of the quality of the instructor that we have at Brazosport College. We're very proud of the work that they do. Molly, Jackson, I want to thank you guys for being with us today, talking about all things art related. Students, community members, come out and take one of these classes. You will not be disappointed. Like I said, we have got some of the best instructors at any community college in the state of Texas, but we're really proud of what happens in our art classes. Come out, take a class, and find out a little bit about yourself, find out a little bit about the college, make some cool friends, and enjoy the process. We'll see you next time on Chomp Talk.